Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you so much for joining our first alumni webinar series in the topic, Decarbonization of International Shipping, Global and Regional Perspectives on Achieving Reduction Targets. I will just explain a few housekeeping sessions. This webinar is going to run for 1 hour. We are going to use 30 minutes for the presentation and 30 minutes for the Q&A session. So please feel free to use the Q&A session to drop any question that you have along the presentation. After the presentation, we will have the possibility to take your questions and answer. So without further ado, I would like to get things started. I will now pass over the floor to the moderator of today's webinar. Professor Ocha, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Distinguished alumni, very warm welcome from World Maritime University, Malmö, Sweden, despite the fact that nowadays it's really cold. So, next slide, please. So today, 3 faculty will be with you. Myself, Aykut Ölçer, and I am the head of Maritime Energy Management Specialization, and Dr. Anish Hebar, the second speaker. He's from Maritime Safety and Environmental Administration. And the third speaker is Dr. Henning Jessen from Maritime Law and Policy Specialization. Next slide, please. So today's seminar is all about decarbonization of international shipping. So this slide will be very briefly looking into the drivers of decarbonization in particular, but in broader terms, air pollution. What are the motivation and drivers? First of all, air pollution resulting from international shipping is very much linked to energy production and its consumption on board ships. So the 6 drivers you see in this slide are the drivers for us to manage the energy in a better way or in an optimal way on board ships. So as you all know, or some of you might know that when it comes to air pollution, there are 2 categories, an air pollutants category and the greenhouse gases category. The first category mainly causes human health problems, while the greenhouse gases, GHG, causes climate change. As you all know, climate change is a very big issue today. The whole human civilization is facing. Now, in the maritime industry, we have one way or another solutions to remove and mitigate air pollutants. However, it is not, or we cannot say the same thing for GHG resulting from maritime operations, which means that we don't have a silver bullet technology or practice to remove GHG from the maritime operations. That's why the whole basic, the motivation and the effort is going to energy efficiency, which means that we do the same thing with less pollution. So that's why the first driver is what we do is not good, but please remember, we are the most fuel efficient mode of transportation. However, we are not the most environmentally friendly mode of transportation. The second driver is, do we have international regulation? Yes, of course. International Maritime Organization has already regulation to regulate air pollution resulting from international shipping. And relevant to today's webinar is the one, GHG aspects is covered under the MARPOL Annex 6 and in particular Chapter 4. So there we have already an international binding regulation for regulating and the reduction of air pollution, and in particular the GHG towards decarbonization effort. And on top of this, IMO in 2018 responded to the pressure coming from the Paris Agreement in the form of a strategy, which we call it IMO GHG strategy. So definitely the first bullet, what we're doing is not good, and then we have to do really do something to reduce air pollution. And the second item is we have already an international binding regulation we have to comply. Third driver is fluctuating character of fuel oil price or the volatile fuel price. Past expensive, today low, and the future it might be again high. So in this respect, this fluctuation and volatility can be also minimized with a good energy management practice on board the ship. World population, and world population is the main driver, not only for the aspects we are dealing today and in the maritime industry, but also on our daily lives. Whatever we're facing, the challenges and the issues, they are all linked to the increased world population. The increased world population means more demand, and more demand means more transportation, thereby the more seaborne transportation, which will be leading to more energy demand and the prices. And the fifth one is because international shipping, especially the majority of shipping sailing today in the oceans, they rely on fossil fuel, and fossil fuel is limited in the world. So one way or another, one day definitely we'll be running out of what we have, let's say within the 50 or 70 years time. And this is called fossil fuel trio, like the gas, coal, and the oil. That's why managing energy in an optimal way is always a good way forward. Last but not least, and also is not binding, the United Nations has also an agenda called 2030 Agenda, and this agenda is allowing the whole human civilization to grow in a sustainable way. And the relevant SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, to today's webinar are SDG 7, Affordable and Clean Energy, and the Climate Action 13. So let me conclude my part, and then I will pass the floor on to my colleagues. And the bottom line of today's webinar is the challenge we are facing is huge. Targets set are very ambitious. So in this respect, in order to solve or overcome those challenges, we have to work together, which requires global cooperation, which requires innovative thinking, and even which requires a paradigm shift and a mindset change and on an individual basis. So my colleagues will be definitely touching upon elaborating more all the aspects I just introduced. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to my colleague, Dr. Anish Hebar, and he will be touching upon the background and the global scene. Later on, my colleague, Dr. Henning Jessen, will be looking into regional perspectives, in particular European Union. Thank you. Dr. Hebar, floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Professor Alcher, for a wonderful introduction and oversight to the entire topic of greenhouse gases and climate change. It is my honor and privilege as a former student myself to be making this presentation for our wonderful alumni. And I begin with the background to the IMO and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Policy. As we can see from this slide over here, from the very early 60s and the 70s, there was already a call for international attention to the threats posed by global warming. And no sooner than later, by 1988, already the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Program for Environment, UNEP, they came together to create the IPCC, which is the International for Climate Change, Panel for Climate Change. So once this IPCC, the panel was formed, within 2 years, they came up with a report which reflected the views of more than 400 scientists. And they were unanimously voicing their concerns for global warming and urged that something should be done. So based on this, based on the results of the panel, the IPCC findings, they made a presentation to the Rio Summit in 1992. And thereafter, 5 years later, so the UNFCCC was formed, and 5 years later, we had the Kyoto Protocol, which came up with binding targets for 37 industrialized countries, including the European Union. A couple of years later, that is in 2001, it also set up the rules for implementation of these binding targets. And soon after that, there was the Paris Agreement, and that was in 2015. And on the one hand, whereas the Kyoto Protocol had provisions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from aviation and shipping, of course, through the auspices of the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization. On the other hand, the Paris Agreement did not make any reference to the IMO or the ICAO or the emissions from shipping and aviation. That brings me to the next slide, which is a brief mention of the Paris Agreement, which is the whole driver for all our efforts, collaborative efforts across the globe. And the commitment which is made, it's a commitment to deep decarbonization, as we call it. And the overall objective is to keep global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade, above pre-industrial levels. So that's the baseline. The baseline is the pre-industrial levels, and achieve net zero emissions during the second half of the century. That is, before we reach 2100, we would like to have net zero emissions. And of course, last year we had this global pandemic, and when we look at the data, we find that there was a 6.4% dip in emissions, but the outlook is the emission reductions which were achieved because of the pandemic may not necessarily lead to overall reduction, which would be motivated and driven by the efforts at the global and the regional level. Next slide, please. So now I bring you to the dateline. I started off with the background. So now I have the dateline on the maritime greenhouse gas emissions. So of course, we had the MARPOL Convention by the IMO. And when you look at 1997, it's almost the same time as the Kyoto Protocol. We had the new chapter, we had the new annex to MARPOL, Annex 6, which was mentioned by Professor Alcher. And thereafter, in 2000, there were a series of studies. I will come to it later. But first and foremost, what happened with the creation of the new Annex 6 was the mandate was established for the IMO to deal with greenhouse gas emissions and control and take charge of these greenhouse gas emissions. And in 2011, we had when you look over here, you see the EEDI, the Energy Efficiency Design Index, and the SEEMP, as they are called in short, that's the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan. So this was a landmark achievement as far as the IMO and the Maritime is concerned, because after the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, so it's nearly 13 years after that, it was the first ever mandatory global energy efficiency standard for an international industry sector, and also global mandatory greenhouse gas reduction regime. So this was really a landmark achievement, and which is really celebrated by the Maritime, and which really set the pace and the ball rolling on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Thereafter, I mentioned to you the Paris Agreement, and at the same time as the Paris Agreement, the first phase of the EEDI was launched, and which aims at achieving 10% reduction in carbon intensity of ships. And after that, the other thing I would like to highlight is when you look at 2019, for example, so there's the fuel oil data consumption system standard. It's called the IMO DCS. This is very important because I will come to the IMO initial greenhouse gas strategy a bit later, but the whole process was driven by the roadmap in 2016. So once you had the roadmap, which took the threads from the Paris Agreement, and the roadmap set the process for the entire strategy to achieve reductions in greenhouse gases. And the strategy is driven by the data. So nothing could be accomplished without data, for which the IMO established a whole set of greenhouse gas studies. So the first one was done in 2000. I will come to it later, but this is how it was driven. And the data is very important because you are aware, last year we had the first set of data which was collected, and this summer, this spring, already the results would be published. And some of you who are following this topic very closely would have seen that the EU has already published its findings from the MRV legislation. Next slide, please. So how do we achieve this very ambitious goal which has been set out by the IMO? If you look at the graph on the one side, it shows the absolute values over here. So 2008 is the baseline year as far as the emissions, the norms are concerned. And if we do nothing, if we proceed with business as usual, you can see over here, we would reach somewhere above 2,500 million tons of CO2 emissions from all sources. So how does one take charge of this? So there were two measures which were initiated by IMO. The design measures, so which is the EADI, and the operational measures, that is the SEMP. The two of these put together would not be enough. As you can see, the blue and the yellow bar, these areas put together would not be enough. And that is why we have this strategy, which is the green solid area and the green dashed lines. So these are very critical to achieve net zero as far as the emissions are concerned. And how does one achieve this? So there is a wide range of options which is available to us. If you look at this nice figure of this container ship over here, and if you look at those bubbles below the ship, these are all the various measures which relate to the fuel which will be used by the ship for undertaking those voyages. So the various options are basically alternative low carbon and zero carbon fuels. And at the same time, if you look at the aft of the ship, where it shows 5 to 15%, so that's where the innovative machinery, equipment, and other systems come into play. So that's a designer's role. And on top of the ship, when you look at it, so those are the various operational measures, and it also shows the values, the values of reductions which could be achieved by employing each of these individual options or measures. Next slide, please. So what is this IMO initial greenhouse gas strategy? So if you look at this milestone, when I mentioned this roadmap to you, so this is the very first milestone having this initial strategy. And based on the data, the fuel oil consumption data, which is collected by the IMO through its the DCS, the IMO DCS system for the whole of the globe, and the EU using its MRV legislation at the local level. So there will be some adjustments made. So after after the first set of data is available to the IMO, so within the next year, it will make some adjustments to the initial strategy, and then it will be followed up with 2 more sets of data being analyzed, and then we will come with a revised strategy. So this is the whole aim. So you start with the initial strategy, you make some adjustments, and as you can see at the bottom of the slide over here, by 2023, you would have a revised strategy. And this cycle of 5 years will continue. And if you place it alongside the operational and design measures, so they are also running in a 5-year cycle, so to say. So the EADI is revised, or you have a next level. So EADI phase 1 looks at 10% reduction. EADI phase 2 after another 5 years looks at another 10% reduction. That's how it continues. So they are all running in 5-year cycles. So what is the benefit of having this strategy? First and foremost, the vision is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping and phase them out as soon as possible in this century. So this is very important. We would like to phase them out in this century and not take it forward. So peaking as soon as possible. And the pathways will be for CO2 emission reduction. And of course, it will be consistent with the Paris Agreement. And there are several guiding principles which are important, which need to be kept in mind. First and foremost is non-discrimination, then no more favorable treatment. And alongside no more favorable treatment, it's also the applicability to all flagships. And of course, then there is the consideration of common but differentiated responsibility, and the impacts on states when we look at implementation of these different measures. And last but not the least, you look at evidence-based decision making, and of course, countering it with the precautionary principles. So these are the guiding principles when we look at framing this the strategy. And then what will be achieved? So there are 3 levels of ambition which have been set out in this initial strategy. The first and foremost level of ambition, it applies to the carbon intensity of ships, which is expected to decline. And this will be achieved by implementing the EADI in phases for new ships. And the second ambition is carbon intensity for the international shipping to decline. And there you look at the carbon dioxide emissions as per transport work or ton mile. And the aim is you achieve 40% by 2030, and as you can look over here, 70% by 2050. And the third level of ambition is for greenhouse gas emissions. So you have the carbon intensity on the one hand, and on the other hand, you look at the greenhouse gas emissions to peak and decline within 2100. So zero emissions as soon as possible within the century. Next slide, please. So while you have this strategy, it's always important to build on the momentum. And that's why you have this program of follow-up actions which is framed at the IMO. And this basically uses, it's like a planning tool for working at the IMO, and it facilitates meeting the timelines which have been identified in the initial strategy. And as you can see over here, the first block of years is running up to 2023. And within this block, the first block, the primary focus would be on short-term measures. And these short-term measures, we call them the candidate measures, because you need to examine these measures carefully and evaluate them and then take a decision. So that's why they are called the candidate short-term measures. And they are grouped into three categories. Group A is one which can be addressed under existing instruments, and Group B is that are not a work in progress, and they would be subject to some kinds of analysis. And the Group C is the most challenging one. Work is not in progress, and they are presently not be able to subject it to any kind of data analysis. The fourth bullet point over here is midterm and long-term measures. So this will be addressed basically through technological innovations. So primarily the focus will be on technology, and then novel fuels, new and alternative fuels, which are zero carbon, low carbon, and so mostly they should be sustainable. And the other bullet points which we see over here are more or less being achieved. Impacts on states, the guidelines, detailed guidelines have already been issued. Fourth GHG study is already promulgated, and capacity building, etc., are a work in progress. Next slide, please. So we have already been discussing the various kinds of measures, and I already mentioned to you the first block. So this ends shortly. We are midway through this first phase. We have passed the midpoint, and there are several short-term measures which are proposed, and you can look up them over here. And some of the important ones are, for example, the operational indicators. So this is a really interesting topic which is of contemporary focus. Various kinds of indicators are being proposed. For example, the energy efficiency per ship hour, the annual efficiency ratio, individual ship performance indicators, fuel oil reduction strategy, etc. When we look at speed reduction and speed optimization, one needs to be very careful. They look simple upfront, but then one needs to take safety into consideration. Also the trade market impact and service to remote geographic areas. So these would be considerations. And another important focus area when we talk of short-term measures is the national action plans. So this envisages development of strategy and policies for greenhouse gas reductions, and guidelines are being promulgated by the IMO shortly. Next slide, please. We will not go into the long-term in more detail, because as I mentioned to you briefly, they primarily relate to the innovation in technology and the fuels, the novel fuels which should be available in the market. As far as the data collection system is concerned, it is already mandatory. The first round of data, which was submitted at the end of the calendar year, is already analyzed, and the summary is obtained. And this diagram over here primarily shows to you the process. So every ship maintains a record of every type of fuel which has been used on board, and all additional data and proxies, more importantly, for all the transport work. And this is reported to the flag state at the end of the calendar year. The flag state then verifies that the data is in accordance, and then issues a statement of compliance to the ships and transfers it onward to the IMO. And this will be used basically for improvising the strategy. Next slide, please. One important element, if one has to be successful in achieving the strategy, is the various capacity building, technical cooperation, and research and development activities. So these are being actively promoted by the IMO and supported and facilitated as well. And some of you possibly have been engaged or been participating in some of these activities. A GLOMEEP, as it is called. So this was the GLOMEEP was the first one. So it was initiated in 2015 with the support of the Global Environmental Facility and support of the UNDP. And it looks at the uptake and implementation of energy efficiency measures. The other one, the GMN, the Global MTCC Network, established 5 technology centers in different continents: Africa, Asia, Caribbean, Latin America, etc. And here the focus is on technology, low carbon technology, and also voluntary pilot data collection. The Green Voice 2050 is a new one. It is supported by the IMO. There are 50 countries and 14 sub-regions. And of course, there are private partners as well. And this looks at demonstration and technological solutions, demonstration and uptake of technological solutions. The Multi-Donor Trust Fund is also established at the IMO, and the Global Industry Alliance, where you see the nice photograph over there. So this was initiated in 2017, and it also supports all these technological and uptake and implementation issues. Next slide, please. So what's happening currently? This slide shows over here the most recent initiatives, the last MEPC in November 2020. So the gray and the green represent 2 sets of measures. One is the technological measures. So it's the energy efficiency design index for existing ships. So how is the ship equipped? And the other one is the carbon intensity. So it's an operational kind of indicator. So it looks at how the ship operates. And when we look at the operations, so there will be a rating, the operational rating based on the carbon intensity. So it runs from A to E, so major, superior, minor, superior, etc. And D and E are the lowest, where the ship is considered to be inferior in its carbon intensity rating. And if a ship has a D rating for 3 continuous years, consecutive years, or if it is E, then there would be a corrective action plan which would have to be drawn up, and the flag state would have to approve this plan. And of course, the last one, the enhanced SCEMP, looks at strengthening the existing operational procedures. It would be subject to approval by the flag state and also be subject to audit. Next, please. So this is a very contemporary topic. It's very contentious as well. This was debated in the last MEPC. The question was whether work should be already started. The market-based measures, if one looks at the proceedings of the IMO, it was one of the first topics of discussion when we were trying to look at the GHG reduction measures. But however, because it was very contentious, it was kept aside and discussions were suspended. The discussions are expected to formally, as per the plan, the original plan, they should start much later in 2023. But since the European Union, you must be aware, this is today's headline I show you over here. Maersk is pushing IMO to take the lead, because when it was raised by Marshall Islands and Solomon Islands in the last MEPC, there was opposition from several governments like China, Russia, and United States and Brazil. So the EU is already pushing ahead. You will hear more from my colleague, Professor Henning Jessen. So I think I will hand over to him for the more exciting part of the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anish, and hello, everyone. I now will discuss a little bit more the regional perspectives. And before I start, apologies that we have to reach a little bit into your Q&A time. But you heard from my colleagues that the topic is actually very complex when it gets to technical details, and basically when you want to address all the short-term measures, which I will not do at all now. And I will also not address the long-term measures, the ones that kind of reach into 2040, 2050. I rather try to wrap things up now by focusing on the medium-term measures. And you see here a copy from the IMO's initial GHG strategy. By defining what those medium-term measures could include, we see that these include new innovative emission reduction mechanisms, possibly including market-based measures to incentivize CO2 emission reduction, or greenhouse gas emission reduction. Is actually a difference. And that, of course, opens a lot of questions. And I will, as I said, I will try to wrap up as quickly as I can. But it's not possible to reduce some complexities. We will have to think about what actually is a new innovative emission reduction mechanism. in the medium term, we will have to ask ourselves, and that is also what I would like to ask you now, what actually incentivizes GHG emission reduction? How can first movers benefit? And what are the necessary requirements? And the necessary requirements are, in addition to the operational and technological measures that have to be implemented, we need data. So it's as easy as it seems. We need to collect data and to evaluate this data, but it is actually not an easy task. It is a time-consuming task that will extend over a number of years now. But I would like you all to note that the requirement and one of the preconditions to introduce market-based measures is an assessment and a scientific evaluation of the emissions data that is available. And that is what has been agreed at the IMO level, and which is initiated or has been initiated since the last 2 years. So data is of vital importance, and how to collect data and how to evaluate it for the future. And I would like now to come to the elephant in the room by first naming another elephant in the room. You'll see here the US Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, which is not a given law yet, but which was proposed by a member of the House of Representatives. And I only included this to highlight the fact that this act also includes the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements that are necessary. So basically the idea of a unilateral US approach on collecting data. And these verbs, monitoring, reporting, and verification, is something that is already done within the EU. So one of the ideas of delivering this alumni webinar was that a faculty member which originates from a non-EU country kind of sets the global scene and introduces the IMO members and the latest measures and the latest steps. And I now, as someone who originates from an EU country, will address the EU measures that have been taken over the last 5 to 6 years and to explain why those already exist without being able to go into further details. But what we can see is that we already have now two different streams of collecting data regionally via an EU regulation, which is called the MRV regulation, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And we have the introduction of the global data collection system via the IMO. And that means we have already two running systems. And the question is whether we can streamline those approaches of data collection in the future. The reason why this has been introduced by the EU was already introduced 6 years ago by the fact that shipping was the only sector that had not been included in climate mitigation measures so far, and that has now been achieved from an EU perspective since 2018, because since this year, this MRV regulation is in force, and the data is collected since then. Quickly, the phases that are being undertaken as part of this approach is simply to collect the data, to implement the regulation, and to establish this as a baseline for future measures. So this is currently ongoing, and the data is reported to EMSA via the EU flag states. So I copied here the database, which is called THETIS, and where companies, verifiers, and flag states have access. So you can access the website, but it is not open for the public. But what is done afterwards is that the data is published, evaluated, and these are the next two phases, ultimately leading to a conclusion on how to potentially implement market-based measures. And one of the differences that we have to note between the IMO and the EU approach is, for example, the approach to how to process the data. The EU publishes an annual report of the collected data, where some argue that it also includes commercially sensitive data, and also the baselines for which data has to be reported, for example, includes under an EU approach cargo carried and a different understanding of transport work. So it's again the challenge of how to align those different approaches a little bit better in the future. And I've included also in my presentation slides here the first annual report on CO2 emissions from maritime transport published by the European Commission last year amidst the pandemic, where we had the first 77 pages reports about the 1 year of collecting data in EU ports. So this is an important document and has received a lot of criticism. You might remember some headlines I copied here too, where there was a lot of basically different understanding of how to learn from the data. For example, MSC was openly identified as one of the biggest polluters. And of course, it objected to this interpretation of the data. And that is why the EU had to argue or came back with the notion that it is still work in progress and that we don't draw ultimate conclusions from the very first report, but it will remain that approach under the regulation that ships have to, or that these data has to be reported whenever a foreign flagged or EU flagged vessel, doesn't matter, calls at an EU port. So really, really important to see that the data collection had already started before there was actually an understanding, a common understanding at the IMO level in that regard. The last element of what I would like to say is simply to explain why we actually have now these potentially different pathways of dealing with CO2 emissions and how shipping as a sector should be regulated in that regard. And the background of all of this is, to some extent, the fact that the EU has decided at the end of 2019 to inform about the new European Green Deal, as you can see here. And I had to include this quote from the new, at the time, a new president of the European Commission, which she basically compared the launch of the Green Deal of the EU with landing on the moon, which is probably a little bit overdone, but it indicates to everyone listening now the importance that internally, from an intra-EU perspective, the climate change topic and the mitigation measures actually have. So it is seen as a very serious matter and a very serious steps that have to be implemented in the future. So this is how we can visualize it, and sustainable transport, all sectors, is part of this European Green Deal, which extends across all industries. So we cannot go into any kind of detail here, but basically the general message is shipping is not to be excluded from other measures and other industry sectors when it comes to the inclusion in EU measures. That is what we have to understand, why we can now witness these diverting paths, so to speak. And this boils down, I can summarize a little bit, to a target or a potential political objective of including the shipping sector into the already existing emissions trading scheme of the EU, the already existing emissions trading system, where we already have a lot of trading actually in operation since almost 15 years, and where the effectiveness is step by step increased. So it came with a lot of deficiencies, but you can argue that it generates effect, and it is seen as one of the most important instruments, again, from an intra-EU perspective, to achieve climate change reduction targets, the ultimate topic of this webinar, because actually we don't dispute the fact that reduction targets have to be achieved. The question is how. And that is why we have these intra-EU documents where there is political pressure, regulatory pressure to do more than just operational and technical measures, everything that my colleague just had introduced under the short-term range. And of course, ICAO and IMO are acknowledged as the global players, but there is a certain degree of impatience and also no willingness to move back. Ultimately, we can summarize this in those big letters that are included here. Internally, from an intra-EU perspective, the European Commission and some member states, also some shipping companies based in the EU, refer to a legal obligation to do more, to act, and not to follow the pace of the ones that are a little bit less ambitious. So there is basically no way out, and these decisions that basically had already introduced a potential unilateral pressure and pathway of the EU are actually quite old. They date back almost 20 years. And then the EU has backed off and basically waited for the IMO to undertake new measures. But I think we are now in 2021 at a phase where the EU will not wait for the IMO because the political pressure is enormously high. And that I'm getting now closer to the end of what I wanted to say, but again, you see, I like to work with those industry headlines from Lloyd's List or from other newspapers. What we can see is a certain diversion of approaches and political expectations where a number of non-EU IMO members kind of reject the approach and the impatience that is displayed internally by the EU. It is all complicated by the fact that the EU is not an IMO member, but basically the EU member states are IMO members. But on the other hand, the EU is a member of the UN framework on climate change and the relevant convention, and it's a member of the Law of the Sea Convention. So it is a little bit difficult to argue that the EU has no role to play in there because it can mandate its member states to implement certain steps based on EU law. And that is why these approaches have to be harmonized and why it is basically possible for the EU to exercise pressure on the global level without being a member of the IMO. And we have witnessed that in the past as well when it came to anti-fouling, for example, or even earlier when it came to double hull and how double hull tankers had to be integrated or single hull tankers had to be phased out. So if we take that a step further, that might even open the doors to even more difficult measures like carbon border tax adjustments. Ultimately, it will boil down in the next years to a zero tolerance treatment of free riders, where the EU is unwilling to accept that there are other areas of the world where we could basically evade the climate mitigation measures, or basically where you could kind of to play by other rules. But that is something that is a little bit more far ahead. I would conclude my little section here of this joint presentation that there is a high likelihood that we will see later in the year, particularly in June, when the Commission will come out with a legislative proposal, that shipping will be subject to measures which have not yet been agreed at the IMO level. Whether that will ultimately mean the inclusion in an emissions trading scheme will have to be seen. It could also mean something different, like, for example, the creation of a new fund where all the players, all the shipping companies, everyone calling it a U-port have to contribute to. But my prediction, so to speak, for 2021 and beyond is that we will see a diversion of activity, and where the IMO will have to also do more, or the membership of the IMO will have to do a little bit more than to focus on the details of operational measures. But of course, the devil is in the detail, and there are lots of different views on that topic, which we might be able to see also in the Q&A section, which is now about to start. Apologies for extending the time, but it is a very complex and difficult topic where we also have to set the scene a little bit, but I leave it with that. And I will hand over to our moderator again. And let's have a look at the questions that have arisen in the meantime. Thank you very much. I unshare now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yesa. It was a really rich content, but as my colleagues highlighted, it is a big topic and challenges are big and the targets are ambitious. So before the QA session, just basically without taking too much of your time, so far we basically discussed the challenges and the IMO response. Actually, WMU, World Maritime University, your university, also responded to those challenges in the form of educational products. What are those educational products? And WMU has a full specialization called Maritime Energy Management, which was launched in 2016. And then we are running today the 5th cohort. In addition to this, for those of you who are really busy and not able to come to Malmö to spend 14 months, we have also a postgraduate diploma in the same field. It's called Postgraduate Diploma in Maritime Energy via distance learning. So these are the educational products, and those educational products of World Maritime University are supported with the research stream called Maritime Energy Management. And then we have projects with the International Maritime Organization and with EU funding, as well as also the regional support. And on top of this, also the stream has PhD students. We also develop professional development activities and workshops. Please check our website. And to give you just an example, the last thing we did, and in Caribbean region, we basically delivered a workshop on global sulfur cap in collaboration with the Danish Maritime Authority. So thank you very much, distinguished alumni. Before basically Dr. Yesen finish, I already checked the question and answer, snapshot. And then I already found out a few questions for me to answer, while my colleagues can check in the meantime any relevant questions to them. Let me start. I will not repeat the questions one by one, but basically some of the questions, maybe the most of the questions are on how we can achieve those ambitious targets. Of course, we don't have the answer. Nobody has the answer. But important thing is those targets are really ambitious. And as my colleague highlighted, went through 2030 targets, 40% carbon intensity reduction can be achievable. But the 2050 targets with regards to carbon intensity and the total GHG reduction is really ambitious with today's technologies. Okay. However, please remember, this is a global challenge, requires global cooperation. As my colleague Dr. Yesen clearly highlighted, as you can see, relevant stakeholders and players are doing their role. EU is pushy, but is a good push. In this respect, developed countries, developing countries, least developed countries has to work together to be able to find the solution for this global solution. And actually, in line with this, MARPOL Annexes 6 has already regulation. Regulation 23 is basically promoting technology transfer. So basically, this global cooperation in some way is already regulated. Now, that is one thing. The other thing is, since the targets are too ambitious, one of the main element within the big picture is the technology and innovation. So basically, we need a really novel technology to be able to make significant reduction or to be able to remove the GHG drastically or entirely. So in this respect, technology will be playing a very important role. Today, we don't have a silver bullet technology, as I highlighted at the beginning of this webinar, to remove the GHG entirely. Suppose that you have a technology. Now the question is it a commercially viable technology? Okay, this is always we have to remember, and it might be a technology, but this technology, it might not be a commercial viable technology for the ship owners to implement. So in addition to this, as I already highlighted, the regulation side and the technology side, and also the economics. So regulation side, my colleagues already touch upon in detail, in sufficient detail, and it is creating a good pressure, but is not the full solution. So basically, decarbonization, we have to see the decarbonization in a holistic manner rather than single dimensional. And all the elements I highlighted need to work together in a harmony to be able to find the solution, this global solution. And who will be doing the solution? And everybody. So basically, global cooperation is also key. And in line with this, another question is, how about the impact of all these targets and the measures on the least developed countries and the smaller island developing states? Actually, this was the main discussion, one of the main discussion at MEPC 75 last November 2020. And now IMO is basically preparing a comprehensive impact assessment. And I can also proudly saying that the World Maritime University is also part of this work, and hopefully to be able to find the impact, whether it is severe or not, to be submitted to MEPC 76 in June 2021. And if you ask my question, as being myself a naval architect, what are the solutions? Solutions are hundreds of solutions, technical solution, operational solution. So the ones that will be helping us significantly, such as the carbon intensity reduction by 2030 and 2050, of course, speed reduction due to the relation between the speed and the power, but also the market-based measures or any other economic measures which will be welcomed by the industry. And of course, last but not least, definitely the zero emission fuels, alternative fuels. They are also classified as short-term measures and medium-term measures, as well as the long-term measures. So let me just stop here. I can come back again, whether my colleagues found some questions to answer. My colleagues?
Yeah, I have one, and I can answer one question, and I've already opened this slide again, which is basically a summary of everything or almost everything we said. So one question that was addressed to me is whether if or when the EU actually would include the shipping sector in emissions trading as a market-based measure and as a unilateral measure, whether that would generate effects that are positive for the global climate. And of course, it's not possible to completely answer that question, but it brings us back to the question of what is an incentive. And it seems to be that the ship owner, or from a ship owner perspective, they would rather prefer to contribute to a fund which has to be administered, to contribute to the measures that you can see here on the left hand of the slide. So the variety of design, operational, and economic solutions. So to create basically millions, if not billions, that are available to optimize the way the ships are built, and also to optimize alternative fuels. So if you ask me for a yes or no, I would probably also tend to the view that the inclusion of shipping in emissions trading is less efficient than maybe a research and development fund, which really yields and generates results. But the political dynamics might be different. And at the moment, they seem to look different, which might in the end lead to an inclusion in the emissions trading system that already exists. And that is a difficult outcome for many non-EU based stakeholders. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yesen. Dr. Hebar, any question you want to reply?
Yes, maybe I would like to respond to two comments over here and two questions. The first question related to data integrity, because there are several players and stakeholders involved in the collection of the data, right from onboard ship to the recognized organizations to the flag state, and finally it gets deposited in the database, whether it is the THETIS database at the EU level through the MRV regulations or the IMO fuel consumption data system. Yes, integrity is very much an issue. If one looks at the greenhouse gas studies, the first two studies, Professor Alcher is an expert on greenhouse gases, but the first two studies were only looking at the fuel which was supplied. So it was only looking at the supply side. And if I have to put it in that market terms, but when you looked at the third greenhouse gas study, so it looked bottom up as well as top down. So the data was collected from the ships, from all these sources as well as from the fuel supplies. So that way, I would say it was partly resolved. So you're not looking at it from only one direction. So that I would say is broadly addressing. So you're not only looking at the individual ship level, you're also looking at the supplies by all the suppliers. So that is as far as the integrity of data is concerned. But of course, some questions would remain, and there are ways to look at it at a global level as well. The second question related to the stakeholders, it said that should it be only the ship owning part trying to carry the sole burden of greenhouse gas reduction on their shoulders, or should the other stakeholders be participating? Well, this is a very interesting question, and as we have seen from the various initiatives of the IMO, and of course it is mentioned as a cautionary note in the strategy as well. There are several stakeholders who have a key role to play. There is the financiers, there is the shipbuilders, designers, the engine manufacturers, fuel suppliers, ship owners, charterers, the national governments. They have to make their own national plans now and come up with strategies and policies. So everybody has an important role to play. And of course, it would be driven by a market as well. So you have the market-based measures coming into play. And if you looked at the IMO capacity building initiatives as well, so there also various stakeholders are involved. It's a public-private partnership as well. So I would, to sum up, I would say it's not for one party to resolve it alone. And as Professor Olcher has mentioned, it's very ambitious and it would involve close cooperation of all stakeholders. Thank you. Professor Olcher?
Dr. Hebar, thank you very much. And also Dr. Yesen. There is one more question we didn't touch upon, and the port. Port is a very important stakeholder in this big picture. When it comes to air pollution reduction or GHG reduction, there are already operational measures which are connecting ships and the ports, such as virtual arrival or basically onshore power supply provided to ships. So it is much, much better than 10 years ago. And also, let me open a parenthesis. When it comes to IMO discussion, let's say 20 years ago, ports were not in the big picture. It was a really ship-centric. Now, finding the solution, overcoming the challenges we are facing as of today, and we started to expand the chain. And now ports are included. Most likely in the near future, other elements of the supply chain might be also come into the big picture. Yes, ports are important. Efficient ports and efficient communication between port and ships is definitely an important as an important role. In line with this one, maybe also we never touch upon, we have been always referring to the ship, but of course fleet efficiency, and if you look into the second greenhouse gas study, and fleet efficiency can provide a kind of a potential with regards to CO2 reduction is 50%. So in this respect, port-ship relation, ship-centric technical and operational measures, especially the things you can do fleet, and these are definitely a kind of the options, solutions for us to go forward. Another important element, let me highlight, please always remember, when it comes to solution, those solutions are ship-specific and company-specific, nation-specific, which means that there is no kind of a set of solution you can apply one ship and you get good results and now you apply to another vessel. That's why it is challenging, one of a kind, but it's very important to understand, and achieving the targets at the company level, at the nation level, or the regional perspective-wise at the EU level requires a kind of a optimal combination for the problem you have at your hand. I solved the port question, and the second question I also solved, the relation between the air pollutants and the premature deaths. It's not directly linked to decarbonization because it's linked to the air pollutants like the NOx and the SOx emissions. And of course, as I just told at the very beginning of the webinar, and there are technologies to remove NOx and the SOx emissions. With a good engine design, you remove NOx, and with a basically good fuel, you remove the SOx aspect. So that's why we are already doing very well in this respect. I don't remember the statistic at the moment, but in the past, there are already studies, and due to the air pollutants, and there has been an increased number of premature deaths all over the world. But because of the actions we took with regards to air pollutants, also the actions taken by the road transportation, and definitely now we are in a very good shape with regards to premature death and the air pollutants. Let me see one more time. Maybe there is one question. And there's also another good thing. Yes, I see all familiar names are either basically postgraduates, graduates, or the alumni. And also now Mr. Gavin Allwright with us, great supporter of the university. So colleagues, do you want to answer any other question while I'm checking the question, please?
Professor Alcher, I just wanted to mention regarding the ports. I think because of paucity of time, I did not say it, but it is one of the specific items which is listed in the short-term measures in the initial strategy. And in MEPC 74, there is a specific resolution inviting member states to encourage voluntary cooperation between the ports and the shipping sector. So this shows the increasing importance. I mean, the goals and ambitions cannot be achieved without both the port and the shipping sector working in close cooperation. Yes. And there is one more point here. It raises the question on the impact on states. Well, there are several models which have been proposed. There is the cost-effective analysis models, the maritime transport cost models, etc. And the strategy envisages that for every measure which is proposed or intended to be implemented, the marginal abatement cost curves need to be calculated and taken into consideration. So that's the approach at the international level.
Yes, Dr. Habar, thank you very much. Actually, thank you very much to Mr. Allwright. And definitely we forgot to mention something, which is a very important element, renewable energy, especially the potential of wind energy. And I apologize not mentioning for this one. And of course, not only the speed reduction, but also the technologies, and especially wind assisted ship propulsion is gaining more importance than ever, which has definitely great potential to be able to help us achieving all these global ambitious targets. And always remember, just go back to 50 years ago, we were already sailing with the wind energy from Finland and all the way to Australia carrying timber. I think in terms of time, although we were a bit late.
One last comment, only one sentence. Actually, we touched on what you just said by mentioning the importance of research and development. Yeah, and if ship owners, for example, rather prefer to pay into a fund than to be included in a bureaucratic system that is unknown to them, that would contribute to new innovative design and other approaches on alternative fuel and so on. So indirectly, we touched it. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Fantastic. And there was also one question. Can alumni contact us? Of course, distinguished alumni, that is your university. Probably amongst us, Dr. Habar is the only WMU graduate. I didn't graduate from WMU, but of course I'm privileged and honored to be part of WMU. You can contact us anytime for further information, any support we might be able to provide to distinguished alumni. I think that's all from our side. Again, thank you very much for joining this webinar despite your very busy schedule. Okay, and then we wish you all the best and the success in your professional life and also in your private life. So that's all from my side. Maybe my colleagues also can say one final word.
Well, thank you very much for attending. It's, you know, we cannot address everything. I saw a number of questions unaddressed. And relating to the political level, to the technical level, and to the more economic setting. So, of course, I join my colleague Professor Oelcher in highlighting our willingness to answer questions also later or whenever the occasion arises in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much from my side as well. It was a pleasure joining this webinar.
So I will pass the floor to Ms. Charlotte, please. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for attending today's session. It was quite engaging. And questions that have not been answered during the live session will be answered in the days ahead. And I will personally email them to you, including the presentation. So thank you to the panelists for such an engaging discussion. Have a great day and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.